happiness is the key issue. I'm guessing that I may even be more happy than you in being here, because whereas you signed up for this, maybe cursed a bit this morning about getting up extra early, I am very excited to be in a room full of grown-ups, because I am currently on maternal leave, and I usually hang out with a guy who's happy about things like Tinky Winky singing about his back. Tinky Winky is a Teletubby, for those who don't know. So you can say I need some new input. And that I know I will be getting here today from our eminent guests. The questions that we're going to try to get answered is whether the government or the state should try to maximize happiness for its citizens. And let us begin by welcoming our speaker, our head speaker, Christian Bjørnskov, who is Associate Professor of Economics at Aarhus University, and he will try to provide us with an answer.
Well, thank you, and well, again, thank you for getting up this early, and thank you for speaking English. Really happy about that. Should government maximize happiness? It's getting to be a big question in a number of countries. Countries like France, Switzerland, Australia, the UK have set up departments within their statistics offices to measure happiness. Sometimes they get it extremely wrong, with fun results for those who are not working there. But we're not going to talk about that. So the way I structured this discussion today is in 3 bits. About ability. Can government affect happiness positively? Is it at all possible for them if they would want to? Next bit is the willingness. Do politicians, and this is not our ideal, these are real life politicians, do they have the right incentives to do so if they are able to do that? The last bit is, ought government try to affect happiness? Just, first of all, what are we discussing? There's a lot of confusion about happiness. What is this? So this is one of the very, very few times in my life as an economist where I can show you the brain. But the point is that there are 2 different happinesses. We use the same word. The one in the pink area, the nucleus accumbens, that's the reward sense of the brain. That's the immediate happiness. Getting the right Christmas present, getting a great meal, having sex, and taking drugs all hit that area. And we know that doesn't last. This is a short happiness. We're not talking about that. So when people say, oh, you can't measure that, oh, it's just momentary, that's the short happiness they're talking about. Obviously, we're not going to talk about that because it depends completely on taste. The long happiness, so a sort of steady evaluation of your own life, is out here in the prefrontal cortex, which is, evolutionarily speaking, a new part of the brain. It's something that we have. It's developed with human beings, but with virtually no other species. You can see it in types of monkeys, you can see it in dolphins. That is where the long-term evaluation of your own life is. We also use the word happiness for that. Quite often, psychologists will tell you that they would like to use happiness, lycka, as a word for the long-term happiness, and euphoria as a word for the short-term. But if you want to talk about this, if you want to have any meaningful discussion, you need to know that difference. The next bit is, it's difficult to discuss without some definition. But it's difficult to measure with a definition. the quote-unquote trick that we're using is that we're not defining it for people. We are not asking what makes you happy. We're asking how happy are you or how satisfied are you with your life these days. Because we know that if we ask people what makes you happy, people are answering what makes them immediately happy. And the answers also reflect what do they think ought to make them happy. They reflect social norms, but not social reality. So the trick is, how satisfied are you with your life as a whole these days? You get an answer, and then you can go back and see what is common for the group of really happy people, what separates people. That way, we get closer to a definition of what it actually is that matters. Without having to define it, people define it themselves. Note that this is not happy. In Scandinavia, you have a problem because it's easier to be happy than to be lycklig. The Scandinavian word lycka is closer to euphoria than the English word happy. If we use satisfied, we know that we're measuring the same thing, but we get a measure, we get answers that can be compared across countries. That's what we do here. That's how we get to know something about what does the government actually do, what makes entire populations happier. That's from the satisfaction question. And that is a very stable evaluation of one's own life. It also gives us some input to, well, that we actually know. It's the oldest and the youngest that are happiest, and you probably also always guessed that which ones are the least happy? Well, that's people in their early 40s. You can see that, right? Men growing bored and buying Porsches. So this is what we're talking about, that stable long-term evaluation of your life as a whole. That's what we might want to affect. So, is that possible? Well, if you want to affect happiness for an entire population, you run into immediate problems. First, ability. This is information elicitation. How do you get to know what makes people happy, what citizens actually want? Sometimes we call this a Hayekian information problem. Usually we use markets for that, because in a market people reveal their preferences by revealing what they are willing to pay for a good. If there's no market, that information is not created. And that way, governments will somehow have to find another way to get to know anything about people's actual preferences, what matters to them, and how much does it matter. It's really, really difficult if you just want to deliver a public good. If you're talking about happiness, you're closer to something that's very, very central to yourself personally, and then it gets even more difficult to know, to get any real information. Next bit is, what if citizens' preferences change? That's also a standard problem in public policy. That you deliver something that you somehow figured out that citizens wanted in the 1970s, but people in 2012 probably do not want that. But politicians have no real way of tracking those changes in preferences. So they very often get it wrong. They deliver old-fashioned solutions to problems that don't exist anymore. Because at some point in time, they agreed that, oh, we need to do something here. It's difficult for politicians in normal situations. If you talk about happiness, it's even worse. And this is an even worse problem, because people differ. Even in a really homogeneous country like Sweden or Denmark, people have very different preferences. And governments have famously hard times getting to deliver anything to people that are not the same. So imagine this is so the typical Swede and his preference for something, some policy. The elicitation problem means that we might think that he's here, we might think that he's there, but even if we hit that median voter, the typical Swede, you're going to get a lot of people out here who would want more of that. You're going to get a lot of people out here who would want less of that policy, whether it's a public service or regulation or whatever it is. If people differ in those preferences, you might hit the typical Swede right, but in total, you're going to get it wrong, because most of the population are out here, away from, most of the population is not typical. And what governments sometimes can do is to get a sense of what the typical Swede wants. But they very, very often do not know anything about how preferences differ. So those are the two problems here. Problems of just getting to know what to do if you would want to do something to increase people's happiness. Imagine that you could solve those problems somehow. Really smart surveys, really great social scientists inform the government about what you might be able to do. Are they willing to do that? Well, you're going to hit the majority problem. What's known as a Downian median voter. Again, the typical voter decides an election. There are very, very few votes at the extreme left. There are very few votes at the extreme right. If you get the typical Swede to vote for you, you're going to win the election. Which means that politicians will often have a very strong incentive to try to get it right for the typical Swede. And they have an incentive to ignore those who are not typical. So, democratic politics favors the typical position and actually gives incentives to completely ignore those who are not typical. But that's where most Swedes are. You get the coalition building problem. In Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, you have a lot of different parties. So you have to somehow form a coalition. And we have a very strong tradition of consensus, which means that you don't not just form the coalition that is necessary. We want to form big compromises, include a lot of people, right? Well, the more you include, the more you have to coordinate on a lot of different interests to get a compromise. And very, very often that means that too many decisions are made. You're going to get public goods, you're going to get service position to the few who really want that. But it's going to be paid by the many who don't. And the more different interests you include in that kind of compromise, the more few you pay, and the more of the many pay for something that they don't want. Well, you could say, well, voters vote for what they want, but the problem is, your vote just doesn't count. It's 1 out of, how many is it, 7 million Swedish voters? The probability that your vote will make a difference is 0. So why know anything about politics, except if you think it's fun? That means that what voters will tell you is very often just nonsense. And the time horizon problem. I should stress that that is bleeding obvious in Danish politics these days. getting elected and staying in the media spotlight requires that you do something. A politician that decides, no, we don't need to do anything, is not going to get in the media and he's not going to get re-elected. You need to do something. You need to be active. And that just means that a lot of stuff is done that is not necessary and quite often completely opposite the long-term interests of the population, or at least large parts of the population. But politicians need to do something because otherwise they're not going to get re-elected. And they do that with a too short time horizon. No one is going to remember the guy who 6 or 8 years ago did something necessary and great. Because that's not where the discussion is today. What you have is an incentive to do something that people remember now and at the next election. That gives you a time horizon problem in politics. That means that you're not going to hit the long-term happiness. You're going to do something that people remember right now. But that long-term evaluation of your own life is really the least interesting for politicians. And the problem is then you tend to forget long-term problems and you implement short-term symptom treatment. Think Greece. If Greek politicians had had a long-term view, they wouldn't be screwed today. But they are. So, governments have problems, the state has problems both in the ability and in the actual willingness of real-life politicians to do something right. So what actually matters? Unemployment matters. Can government affect unemployment in the long run? Yep, but not in any popular way. Employment protection creates unemployment. Trade and globalization, can government affect that? Yep, they can limit it. But globalization is positively related to happiness. More open countries are happier. Again, that means if you really want to make your population happier, you need to stay out of the way. The efficacy and fairness of the legal system and democracy? Sure, the legal system is really, really important. But the best legal systems are the ones that are most independent of politics. If you think that, well, we have great legal systems up here, you're right. In international comparison, the Danish, Swedish and Finnish legal systems are the best in the world. One of the reasons why it doesn't work that well in France is because French politicians keep meddling. Trust is really important. Fortunately, we live in some of the most trusting countries in the world. And individual personal freedom. Let me just give you one tiny statistic. If you ask people, Gallup has done that a couple of years, do you think that you can change things in your own life? 94% of Danes say yes. 93% of the Norwegians say yes. It's only 70% in Sweden. Again, that's not something that governments can actually do something about in a positive way. Government expenditures are negative influences. The larger government becomes, the less happy does the population become. At least when decisions are centralized. When decisions are really decentralized, we can't see that government does anything. The more centralized they become, the more likely is it that the size of the public sector is actually a burden on happiness. Income inequality, there's been a lot of talk about income inequality. I know the spirit of that Wilkinson and Pickett book actually got some debate in Sweden. But there is no proper study that finds any effects of income inequality. It just doesn't matter. for happiness. And long-run growth is important. Economic growth is important. Let me just, I stole this from Justin Wolfers, by the way. The dots here are, on average, how rich are people in a country, and on average, how happy are they. The arrows here show you the difference between the rich here and the poor. This is the Emirates, actually. This is Bulgaria. You can see, obviously, the poor are less happy than the rich in Bulgaria, but they're also really not that happy. The whole point here is that the arrows and the dots point in the same direction. In the long run, income, just material well-being is important for happiness. Money does buy happiness. But probably most of where you can decide what to do with that money yourself.
So money matters, but income inequality doesn't.
Yes.
The issue is the following. Reading Easterling's book, for example, is the life cycle theory.
Yeah.
You can get a sense of what's going to happen as technology becoming more advanced. For example, I'm thinking about transnational loans. And in poor countries, poor people suddenly can compare themselves to the rich.
Yeah, I don't believe Dick's theory about comparisons. Actually, this idea that people compare themselves to someone who's richer than themselves doesn't really bear out in the data. It doesn't matter how much richer people are when you compare yourself. And if it doesn't matter how much richer they are, inequality doesn't matter. There will always be someone who's richer than yourself. Someone you can compare yourself with. But how much richer doesn't really matter. It is an empirical question. And the proper studies find a big zero on that. So ought governments to do something? This is a normative question. It's really difficult to figure out what people, they're not really able. And if they were able, all theory, all experience tell us they're not willing to do something with those characteristics. So the ability to get it right is strongly limited. Democratic incentives are most often wrong. You can actually argue that it's probably easier for a dictatorship to get it right. And the problem is that chances are that governments may forget other equally important problems if they are asked to try to affect happiness. If that's high on the agenda, what is going off the agenda then? Environmental problems? Growth? The third world? The last bit I would say is, well, what happens when governments start measuring happiness? Because they have to measure happiness before they can do something about it. You can't try to have some policy without knowing anything about what that policy does. Now, this is a big problem. Bhutan is the only country in the world with an official policy that says we're not maximizing growth, we're maximizing happiness. But there are no independent happiness surveys in Bhutan. It's all run by the government, and the way they measure happiness has absolutely nothing to do with people's own evaluations. The way Bhutan measures happiness is negotiated by politicians based on what they think their population ought to value. It's the same with the measure that the Sarkozy Commission in France did. It has nothing to do with happiness. That measure is called happiness or the good life, the beautiful life, whatever they call it. But it doesn't measure happiness. It measures something that the French statistician thought would show that France is a better country than the US. Now, it's a major disappointment that they couldn't rig the index to show that France did a better job than the US. And let me just finish it by this very embarrassing story. The British government tried a few years ago to do that. They did a major survey where they asked people, they wanted to know something about happiness because they were honestly interested in it. What they did was that they asked, so, what makes you happy? One of the most common answers was sandwiches and fries. And among men, a lot of people said watching girls. That's the input to British happiness politics. When politicians define what to measure. So the answer is no, they can't, they won't, and they shouldn't. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I let our commentators, please stay with me for a minute. I would like to ask you, you mentioned that dictators might actually have a better shot at getting it right. And I was thinking about this because some of the things that you mentioned that actually do have an effect on happiness and trade, openness, things like this, that are, the government can affect these things, are things where the citizens oftentimes ask for less openness, more control, less trade. What should a government think or do about that? Tell the people, won't make you happy, sorry, no can do?
Well, actually, it's a good question. It's a myth that all citizens don't want globalization. If you look across the EU 27 and you ask people in Scandinavia, in a lot of the post-communist countries, people want more globalization. Just not in France. More than 70% of Danes, same in Sweden, same in Romania, are really in favor of more globalization. But it's less than 30% of the French. And France quite often defines the EU position. So it is actually a myth that people don't like globalization. Up here, they do.
But we have this movement towards more demands for migration control, these kind of things. I mean, this must also affect the overall openness of the country.
Yes and no.
Yes and no.
Well, we know that immigrants tend to become happier when they move to a rich country, obviously. But we can't see any bad effects on the native population. And if you think of that, it creates different problems. But it also, immigration also creates a lot of new things. So to walk out in Stockholm and you find a lot of sushi bars. You wouldn't have had that if you hadn't had immigration from Japan. One of the things that we think, oh, this is extremely Danish, is the Christmas tree. It's German. So immigration does different things. And if it's sort of handled the good way, it gives us new input to what might be a good thing to do in our own life.
Also, I would like to ask you something about, you mentioned some about measuring, problems with measuring. What I'm getting at is this, even in the long-term happiness, I'm guessing people have immensely different scales. If I think about what I would define as having a happy life 10 or 15 years ago, I'm almost embarrassed by the shallowness compared to what I find now. What do these things, how do they influence the measurements of this?
Well, it doesn't influence the measurement, but it is a well-known fact that people tend to get used to improvements. So we just raise the bar. So what would have made us happy 15 years ago doesn't make all that much of a difference today. We need something either new or something better. Go back to Adam Smith. He actually writes that little dissatisfaction is what drives people towards better lives. If we weren't dissatisfied with something, if there was nothing to complain about, our lives wouldn't become better.
If government wants to maximize happiness, it gives itself a harder time. Progressively, it's just harder and harder to make people happy.
It's going to be harder and harder because people want more and more. And the problem is, if it's government, it doesn't feel like someone else that they're paying for it.
Yeah. Okay, we'll talk more later. Now we're going to have some commentary on what you told us. We have two guests. We have Rebecka Carlsson, who is the spokesperson for the Young Greens, and we have Filip Fors, who is a doctoral student at the Department of Sociology at Grön University. Who wants to start? Filip? I know you have the PowerPoint.
Okay, thank you. I will present some reflections I have about the science of happiness and make some comments on Christian's presentation as well. I only have 10 minutes, so it will be a challenge to let's see, there we have it. Okay, let's start with the most important question, I think. What is happiness? Here I have some comments about Christian's talk, because many researchers in the science of happiness define happiness in two ways. On the one hand, you have life satisfaction, a cognitive evaluation of your life. This is the most popular measure of happiness, I think. And then you have emotional well-being, how you feel. And these things are two different concepts. One can be satisfied with one's life without feeling very good from moment to moment in everyday life. Even though most people who are satisfied with their life are feeling good in their everyday life, the correlation between these two measures is only 0.5. So I think many people, when they think about happiness and politics, and they want to know what determines happiness and want to know the international differences, they think about happiness in that sense, emotional well-being. If people are in a better mood in Sweden than in Italy, for example. And more research is showing that these two concepts of happiness have partly different determinants. For instance, income is much more strongly related to life satisfaction than emotional well-being. So it can be problems when one wants to draw conclusions from the studies about life satisfaction, if this is the concept of happiness that most people believe is important. I think it's fairly obvious that happiness is important to social policy in the sense that most people believe that happiness has intrinsic value. It's perhaps not the only intrinsic value, but it may be it may be the most important value. And most people also believe that government to some extent should promote people's welfare or well-being or quality in life. And then one can draw the conclusion that politicians, at least to some extent, could be thinking about people's happiness and how to increase happiness in society. What's missing in the science of happiness? Two things. Happiness of future generation, as you, Christian, said. For instance, what about the environment and environmental problems in the future? The science of happiness can't give any useful information in that sense, I think. And it can't give any information about happiness of non-human animals, at least not the science of happiness as we speak of here. So, can politicians learn something from happiness research? The pessimistic view is that we already knew that people were happier in wealthy, democratic and peaceful nations. So, it doesn't add any new information. Also, culture and social norms play an important role. So, and it's probably hard to change culture. For instance, it's well known that high levels of trust and a culture of individualism is important for national levels of happiness. And I think it's hard for politicians to increase culture. And we also know that happiness is strongly related to personality traits, and some studies find that 40 to 60% of the variation in happiness in a given country can be explained by personality traits. And most measures of life circumstances have only a weak effect. So, in developed nations, the strongest predictors of happiness, both life satisfaction and emotional well-being, is personality traits and mental health. And we also know that activities are quite important. For instance, employed people are happier than unemployed, and people who spend a lot of time with friends and family, doing regular exercise and being in nature on a regular basis is happier. And I think the most relevant results from the science of happiness is the relation between health and happiness. Because many studies show that people systematically overestimate the impact of physical health on their levels of emotional well-being and life satisfaction. But mental health is in an obvious way very important for people's happiness. By definition, people who suffer from depression, for instance, are very, very unhappy. So I think this result can have some impact on how politicians should make priorities when it comes to health. That people's mental health should be the main priority. So that's one important input from the study of happiness, I think. And one can also think about happiness relevant education, because there are many studies that show that people make some systematic errors when they try to think about what makes them happy. So I think it's important to give people more information about what kind of systematic errors people make when they think about happiness and what factors that are important. And also there are more and more studies showing that students and children can learn concrete techniques in order to improve their happiness level. For instance, CBT, techniques from CBT therapies has shown to be quite effective, and so on. So the education area is another important area, I think. So the study of happiness and thinking about happiness can be important in some smaller areas in politics, I think. Not necessarily these, when we think about these larger issues. Okay, that was my comment.
will certainly be a way of raising the overall happiness in the country. One thing that I thought of when you mentioned it is, aren't there very many other arguments to be made for helping people with depression without having to use the happiness debate? I mean, they suffer, we should help them.
Yeah.
They're probably unemployed because of their depression.
Absolutely. But I think the important conclusion here is that you have to make priorities in the health department. So, and I think the interesting thing is that health-related problems that are primarily affecting your physical functions, people adapt very quickly to these problems. So I think that's the interesting point.
Rebecka, I welcome Rebecka Carlsson, who's the spokesperson for the Young Greens.
Share is actually something that is making us more happy. So thanks for that. Okay, I want to make some comments on the presentation. Actually, for this time, I'm almost disagreeing with everything. It's not very often it happens in those kinds of panels. We're sitting and agreeing and almost agreeing, but this time I'm almost disagreeing with everything actually. And I think I will make the comments best in kind of giving my view on the whole thing rather than commenting everything, and then we will have a discussion afterwards. So why should we have a society or economy at all? If we kind of start there. If it's not to make us more happy or more well-being, why should we do it? If economy isn't making us more happy, why should we have it? If society isn't making us more happy, why should we have it? If you ask people, what do you care about? Most people say they want to become more happy. So why shouldn't we have that as our main objective? I definitely think we should do so. But not just happiness. I think when you start to, like right now I'm focusing a lot in welfare measures and how we can reorganize society and economy as a whole to actually deliver what we wanted to deliver. If you have your company, you have your key numbers, and you know that you manage what you measure. If you measure GDP, you will manage GDP. If you measure happiness, you will try to affect happiness. And that's the way it works. So what do we really want? I think in order to know what kind of welfare measures we want and what kind of welfare we want, there are more questions to be asked. There are at least 5. First of all, what do we want society and economy to give us? Most people answer happiness. Not happiness as in, or rather flourishing. Not happiness in the way that, in the illegal substance way, but in a long-term way. And you can't really flourish on illegal substance for very long, then you will collapse. Secondly, if we want to become happy or flourishing, how do we become flourishing? And we know for sure that's not just economy. Of course, if you go to yourself, like, what is affecting you? It's not just the amount of money you have. Rather, it's first the human factor. And that's why you can, like, what is inside of ourselves, how we look at the world, how satisfied we are, like, how we look at the world. My grandparents were only very happy with what they had, for example. I have not been very happy with what I have. I always aspired for more. But that's a mental way of looking at the world. Looking at what you don't have or looking at what you have. And that affects your happiness a lot without that you really don't need more things, but rather being happy with what you have. And that's a shift you can do with yourself. Second thing, the social capital. How happy we are together. How much trust is in a community. And there you have a lot of problems with what was raised with the income differences and so on in a society. And that's also why you see that more equal societies are more wealthy. Thirdly, yes. Yes. And then you can also look at economy, of course. But then maybe not per capita. Maybe what are the people really on the ground, how happy are they, or how much do they have? Or the median rather than the average. So if you ask people, like, do you think that the nation is wealthy? Maybe a lot of the people in a society has not kind of gotten the economy that has been raised or accumulated within a society. Maybe it has only gone to a few riches. Thirdly, who is the society and the economy for? That is also something that has not been brought up. Who should be happy? Is it the average? Is it everyone? That's also something that we must know when we're discussing or formulating goals for the society and the economy. Fourthly, how should we affect other people all around the globe? Today we know that we are affecting other countries in a really bad way, many of them. Many of the countries that are already in really tough positions. When we are measuring or formulating goals for Sweden, for example, should we also take into account how we are affecting others? And fifthly, and not least, for how long do we want to do this? For how long do we want the society and the economy to deliver whatever we want it to deliver? And how much do we need in that case to save for the future? And not just when it comes to nature capital, for example, but also what kind of social capital do we need in order to make it a sustainable development? And right now we're focusing on GDP a lot. What I would say is the hope really is that the discussion about the funny thing about GDP is really finally brought up. GDP was formulated in the early 19th century by an economist called Kusma. And in the introduction to this report, he stated that GDP is only, this is quite funny, only a measure of economic activity and should never ever be confused with a state's welfare or well-being. That was kind of in the introduction. Me being a politician, and there are other politicians here as well, sometimes we maybe don't read the introduction, we just jump to the conclusions. Maybe that is what kind of happened. And now we have focused only on GDP, or mostly on GDP, for about 80 years. And we are not happier. In the Western countries, we are not happier than we were, and then we have been since the 70s. We are not distributing it more fairly now. We are not saving it for the future. And we are affecting other countries badly. So there are all kinds of reasons to start asking, why should we really have a society and the economy? What should we measure and how should we form the incentives? And there are a lot of things going on right now. When 25 Nobel laureates gathered here in Stockholm last year to formulate what are the key solutions for our time, they said, count everything that counts, measure everything valuable, value everything that is valuable, ecosystem services, natural capital, social capital, well-being, and do it now. That was one of the main statements. The OECD, the World Bank are also doing it and measuring it. The Sarkozy report, if you have read it, I don't know if you have, it's a substantial report about maybe 300 pages, 274 I would think, since I was working with it yesterday. And it's focusing on not just the happiness part, but rather what is the objective for our society and our economy as a whole. And opening up for what is, for example, education, what role does it play? Or health. Of course we have different things that we want out of life, but I would say everyone needs health. Everyone needs some kind of education. If you look at the role of to have a democratic voice, for example. It's something that is making everyone more happy. And that's also why you have the huge revolution right now in the Arab Spring, for example. Since even if you have your money, if you don't have a voice, you will go and act at the street, and that's what's happening right now. So it's a lot of things happening. And in June we will have the Rio +20 about green economy. Green economy is, of course, not just about like the environmental economy, but rather really looking at what is the fundamentals in our economy and what do we want it to bring out. So, of course, society, economy, and politics should maximize happiness, among other things. And if it doesn't matter how big it is, it's for sure doing the wrong thing. Right. So I stop there.
Thank you, Rebecka. I would like to ask you, you mentioned the report on education and other things, and your party, the Green Party, has always had somewhat liberal passion for the individual capacity and creativity to create your own life. And for, among other things, you fought for the Swedish school system with the vouchers, and which gave us a diversity of different pedagogics, and this has always been a vital part of the Green Party. And I would like for you to comment on how this works with what Christian told us about when politicians try to bring happiness to people, try to deliver this. They oftentimes fail to deliver to anyone who is not typical. And the Green Party has been about not just catering to the typical voter, but to all different voters. So how do you address that problem?
Well, the politics as it is right now is based in a way, it's structured in a way that is not focusing happiness and not focusing distribution. We are not looking at distribution like really we are not looking at the differences right now. So we don't have the tools to know how different groups, different people are affected, or how their happiness is affected by different measurements and so on, different incentives. So that's why we...
Isn't there a risk if you try to pursue, and if the government tries to pursue happiness as a main objective, that they create very narrow mechanisms that doesn't really fit everyone?
That's why you need to both measure happiness and measure what you believe is affecting happiness. So if it doesn't work, then you will know that, well, it didn't work. We thought, for example, well, GDP will make us happy. Well, right now it doesn't. Okay, that's why we must look at, are we actually getting happier, or are we just getting what we believe is making us more happy, but is it? Because maybe the social capital maybe the trust is worse than it used to be, or maybe the human capital is worse than it used to be, and maybe that's affecting us more than the economic capital. And that's why we must track both the happiness, both how it turns out, and what we think is affecting. So we know if we are delivering the right things.
I'd like to welcome the gentleman up here, and we'll have a discussion all together. Okay, Christian, maybe you want to comment on the comments.
Yeah. Rebecka said that she disagreed with most everything, and I think it's stunning how we disagree on everything here. And in particular, I think it's stunning how little she knows about research. the claim that equal societies are richer and doing well, it's just wrong. There is no evidence whatsoever. There's no evidence in the other direction. Unequal societies are not doing better. It just doesn't matter. There's no relation between inequality and happiness. There's also no relation in general between inequality and economic growth, or health, or life expectancy, or whatever. I mean, proper research shows that it doesn't matter.
Is the confusion in this debate maybe that what people often mean when they talk about inequality is that they want to fight poverty?
Yes.
Yes.
Inequality is not poverty.
Do you think there might be something to this, Rebecka?
No, but it's just that I just don't know how you are looking at the science. Okay, I'm not a scientist. Right now I'm working a lot in the field, and most of the scientists working with well-being and happiness are saying the opposite thing of what you are saying. Both when it comes to income distribution, both when it comes to how economic growth is affecting happiness. I mean, you can see that, well, up to a certain level, it's very important that it's covering your needs, but afterwards, other things are affecting you a lot more. And that's basically what everyone's saying. So it's really hard to comment since it's just wrong.
It was what everyone was saying about 10, 12 years ago. And some people have been really influential. Richard Layard and the Spirit Level, that horrible book, has been influential. But if you do this without any prejudice, and I did that with two colleagues of mine, Axel and Justina Fischer, a couple of years ago, did a major exercise in trying to see what can we actually say. We looked at 74 different claims in the happiness literature to say what actually bears out in the data. That paper included the results of about 850,000 different regressions. That's one of the ways we could say, well, inequality is completely irrelevant. The same with growth. And now Rebecka says that it doesn't matter, but you all saw the picture, didn't you? I think that picture speaks for itself. Growth in the really long run matters.
Filip, you sort of turn the scope a bit towards unhappiness or misery. And I would just like to ask all of you, what's your view on this? Because should we see it as two ends of the same scale? Is happiness here and unhappy here, or are these two different things altogether?
I think it's reasonable to see it as a continuum when you have unhappiness or feeling really bad on the one side and feeling good on the other side. So, and research showed that from moment to moment it is really unusual that people feel both negative feelings and positive feelings at the same time. So it's that extremely strong correlation, negative correlation between feeling good and feeling bad. Sometimes it might happen, but in general it's reasonable to think about it as a continuum.
Christian, how would you answer your first question was answering should government maximize happiness? Should government minimize misery?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point that Filip brings up, and it's something that we've begun to look at again. For some reason, we've done 15 years of research in happiness, and we forgot the misery part. It's quite embarrassing, actually. And of course, I'm also really enjoying that Filip brought it up, because I know Martin Seligman is doing research that I'm doing research with a Taiwanese sociologist right now, where one of the things we show is trust is really important for happiness. The horrible thing is trust doesn't reduce the misery part. Trust is not related to how many people are answering at the bottom of the scale. Something completely different is going on. And there's a big need to figure out what's going on there, and can we find solutions for that. But I think the honest answer, if you're a social scientist, is we just don't know yet. And of course, so perhaps we might get to know something that government can actually do down there. Sure. The honest answer is just we have forgotten it.
You mentioned some things that actually affect happiness or make people unhappy if they're unemployed, for instance. And one thing that I've read also that has effect is whether you're alone or not. If you're married, apparently has an effect on happiness, overall life contention. And I started thinking about the situation in China where the one-child policy has made a completely horrible situation where men can't find women to marry. So there, I guess the government really made people unhappy. But can we then imagine the opposite, that government should make people marry? Should find singles someone to be with?
How many of you would like government to find a mate for you?
Well, I'm just thinking maybe there are a few people out there who can do it.
I think we're back to the information problems, aren't we?
Yeah.
I mean, marriage is a fun thing because we can actually see an effect of people being married, but after 2 years that effect is gone. It's actually about finding the right partner. The marriage gives you a transitory effect. The partner gives you a lasting effect.
It's about sharing life.
It is, and well, you said that with the one-child policy. That solved an ugly policy. It solved other problems in China. I should also stress that, well, contrary to what people think, if you look at the actual data, children are bad for your happiness as long as they live at home. So I mean, again, that's where if you take that as a policy prescription, we shouldn't allow people to have children. But that's just absurd. It's another thing, something else besides happiness that matters there. Where you have to sort of prioritize, is it your own happiness or is it something else, whether you want children or not?
I think we have a question there.
Yes, I think this is a very stimulating session. And okay. My name is Filip Gustafsson. I worked at Även in the 1970s for 12 years, from 1967 to 1980. Yes, I have listened to this, and I thought you, Christian Bjørnskov, you said that if you look at happiness over age groups, you find that the very young are happy and the very old are happy, but people in their early 40s are the least happy. I thought that was very interesting. And comparing also to what Filip Fors said, because you said that education is important and that something should be done with the education, and then you show a picture of 3 sleeping 16-year-olds in the classroom. Boys, that's important. Because, so are these boys happy when they are sleeping in the classroom? Because what they have done is they have been playing computer games all night. So they sleep while they are supposed to have education. And are they happy when they do these computer games and they don't listen to what they are supposed to listen to during the day? So my question is to both to Christian, are these boys happy? And also to Filip, the same question I would think. So,
well, on average, we know what people are like from when they're 18. Before that, they usually don't answer the questionnaires, and if they're too young, they're not able to answer them. But what you... I like Philip brought up emotional well-being and sort of immediate feelings. What you quite often see is that in teenagers and very young people, their day-to-day experiences vary a lot. Teenage girls, for example. They can have great days and horrible days, but their average is very high. The same goes for old people. And there's a lot of really, really detailed Norwegian research here that shows that, well, one of the things is that you get new experiences, new inputs. You learn a lot about yourself when you're young. And when you hit that early 40s, what one of the Norwegians say, so you realize that you're not going to make the football national team. So what's special about when you get older is that you reprioritize and you actually learn what really matters to you when you hit about that age. What you do when you're young is that you try out a lot of things and learn something about your own priorities, your own taste, your own preferences, which is exciting. But if you didn't have that learning period, if someone had told you what happiness is when you were young, you wouldn't know it when you were old. Because that teaching happiness thing might not apply to you.
There's a lot of questions. Okay, up here.
Might I ask a question to Filip Fors as well?
Yes, Filip.
Okay, you mean the question about these young boys
Yes.
and their unhappiness. I think one important part of taking in happiness research, or at least psychology in schools, is that, as Christian said, people learn during their lifetime how to handle different things in life, how to handle emotions and negative events. But if people can be trained already in school to handle difficult problems in life, I think it would be one way of increasing happiness in the long term. But then you will have to find effective ways of doing so, of teaching this, and this could be difficult. But it's at least worth a try, I think.
Particularly for sleeping more.
Yeah.
Because that's, I think it's a big issue that boys are doing worse in school these days. Because
We have a question up there. Yeah.
Is this on? Yeah. So let me see if I did this right. Like today, everything is going to help.
It's not to push it.
Right?
Yes.
Yeah. Like today, everything is going to help. Like we feel like crap, and definitely tomorrow's people won't feel better because we're not like taking care of the planet. And people in other countries most often also feel worse. So still, we feel really bad, and we shouldn't do anything about it. Like, did I get you right there?
The question was for
Christian.
The problem is, and I think that's what I most think Rebecka got wrong, is that you say we shouldn't do anything. Of course you should. But you are not the government. Society is not the government. Most of society exists outside and sometimes despite the government. Of course you should do something about it yourself. In your own life, and you might form an organization, but forcing government to try to do something about it is a completely different question.
Rebecka, you have something?
Oh, you have that.
Yeah, I have this. That's great. But for example, what we could learn in school, how we could get the self-esteem, the self-respect, how we could learn about how to deal with different situations, how we could learn about different subjects, how we could learn how to lead ourselves, how to lead each other. Shouldn't we do that? We can do that outside of school. We can do that when we play computer games. We should not do that in class, and government should not care about it, since it's none of the government's business. For me, it's not logic. Or we know how important it is to have physical and psychological and mental health. Why shouldn't we have it then as an objective, as a government, as a state, to make sure that everyone is getting the mental and the physical health care that they need? We should do that outside. We can do that like the Red Cross, but we should not do it as a government. Is that right? For me, it's
maybe you just didn't get you, because objective, yes, but that may be the objective of maximization. I think that actually the problem that we discuss here is the problem of maximizing things. Because who said that striving after more necessarily implies striving after maximizing? Okay? Because if you really want to maximize happiness, and you have a conception that happiness is sort of life satisfaction, which is the ratio maybe of aspiration to attainment. So let's maybe narrow down people's aspirations instead. You understand the problem? So while happiness is very important, and by the way, it's a multidimensional concept. There is not only emotional well-being or life satisfaction. There is also Aristotelian approaches to well-being, like the agnomonic approaches. Okay? Policymakers have done things about that as well. The capability approach, but Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winner. Okay? There are different ways of looking at the problem. But please bear in mind, maximization, this is the problem. Okay? We should not maximize, but this is not necessarily imply that we should not strive after.
I would just like to hear a comment on the question as there. I'm not sure I buy the premise. Is it true that we feel like shit and that our children will be worse? Just descriptive.
The description means no. It's not true.
Could you expand a little bit?
In the very, very long run, happiness has increased also in the Western world. Now, Dick Easterlin many years ago wrote that that was not the case. But what recent research by Justin Wolfers suggests is that Dick got it wrong. Because what he didn't realize was that they changed the answer categories of the American question several times. So what happened was that happiness increased, then they changed the answer categories such that the average dropped, then happiness increased, and then they changed the answer categories such that happiness dropped again. But it wasn't the same answer category, so you couldn't compare the averages over time. You have to compare them with the same categories, and within those categories, happiness actually increased. It's just a stupid little mistake made in 1974 that has been propagated ever since. And that's the value of Justin Wolfer's research and his wife Betsy Stevenson, is that they take care of those problems that no one really realized we had.
I think both.
And then we get that picture that shows that no, things are not going to help. It's good. It's getting better. Really slowly, and sometimes so slowly that we don't realize it, but it is getting better. That's a descriptive part of it.
Wanted to comment on this. Rebecka, Filip?
Yeah, I think Christian is right here. In most countries over the world, happiness has increased. But it's like looking over, is that glass half empty or half full? Because in many countries, the increase is really, really small. For instance, in Sweden, it's, I don't know if it's even if happiness has increased. If you look at World Value Survey, they measured life satisfaction in 1981, and it was about 8 on average on a 10-point scale. And since then, it has been like 7.7 and 7.8. So I don't know. I don't think happiness has increased in Sweden, for instance. But in many other countries, happiness has increased. And the biggest, the strongest increase has been in countries with historical low level of happiness. I think it's like you can come up to a point where it's harder and harder to increase happiness. If most people feel good most of the time, it's hard to increase levels of happiness, I think.
I think actually, if I just can, you mentioned this in your chapter in the book that I read, that in the surveys, when you try to measure happiness, people tend to answer, a large part of the population that you asked tend to almost max out. They say they're as happy as can be, which creates a problem, because then how do you even measure that something improves? Is this an overall thing with the measuring of happiness? People say that they're just fine and dandy?
No, it's not. It's not a problem as such. But it's right what Filip said. Is the higher the average is, the more difficult does it become for us to see that people are becoming happy. Because if you hit 10, there are no more categories in the question. So even if you answer 10 today, and you know your life has become better the last 5 years, in 5 years' time, you can't answer 11 because...
We need to expand the scales.
We actually would want to expand the scale when you hit that. And it's not evidence that people have stopped becoming happier It's just a problem of how to measure it. And it means that the happier you are, the smaller will the same changes be, because you get more and more people are going to hit the ceiling in a question.
No, rather.
Okay. Yes, the lady in the red here.
So I'm Karin. Let's see, is it on? Yes. I'm Karin Edmark from the Även. So I think I have two questions, mainly to Christian. So it seems that a lot of the debate centers around the problems of measurement. So firstly, if there was a way to know what made people all over the distribution happy, in a way that could be delivered by politicians, do you think that these people should do it then, or is it rather that the government shouldn't do those kinds of things? And then I also wonder, so it seems also that a lot of the research tells us that a lot of people are, or a lot of governments are getting it right, because broadly a lot of people are getting happier. So is that also a question of, should the governments perhaps not trust the detailed research on happiness, because it's still not good enough to tell us in detail what we should do?
Well, broadly speaking, the research has progressed a lot the last 15 years. We have to be honest, there's a lot we don't know. Many details that we just have no idea of. But the broad picture, we get that now. We corrected a lot of the mistakes that previous research did. And the problem of your argument is that you say, well, people have become happier, so the government must be getting it right. What tells you that it's the government that gets it right? It's the same problem I have with Rebecka. She said, if this is important, so government should do it. I mean, are you a communist? What happened to people getting it right? And actually what we observe in detailed research here is that when government does more, in particular when it's centralized, they are likely to get it wrong. It's countries where government does less. And then also countries where government prioritizes really tightly, where people on average are happier.
And that means your argument seems to be rather that people can do it better.
Yeah, my argument, people know better what makes themselves happy. And what makes their friends happy, what makes their colleagues happy. Governments can, of course, set the frame. Funding a proper legal system, maintaining democracy, delivering really central public goods. But above some level, what they do is bad for average happiness. And actually the fun thing is when, I know Marcus has the 2007 paper. What we show in that paper is that the bad effect of government is actually worse if you vote to the left of the middle. It's not as bad for right-wing voters.
I think we have a question here, the gentleman in the dark green.
Well, fine. I enjoyed Christian's presentation very much. At one point, I lost you, although I think your last comment clarifies a little bit what you meant. But you said, you showed us a normal distribution curve, and you said governments try to, for political reasons, to follow what they think the average voter will do. And then you said, and if they do that, they end up dissatisfying the great majority. Well, that would only be true if you had an inverted curve, that the average was very unrepresentative of what most people think. That's what you seem to say. So I didn't follow it, but now I do understand. I've been living in Scandinavia for 50 years plus, but I'm originally an American, and I recognize this distrust of government idea. And I don't really, I don't believe it myself, but I understand what you mean about that. Finally, I'd just like to add that if you're interested in life satisfaction, I recommend choral singing. People who sing in choirs are much happier. It's been proven.
You can just pass the mic on, actually, in that direction. No.
Okay, thank you. My name is Göran Rosenberg, I'm a journalist. It strikes me, Björn, that you are a very, Christian, that you are a very passionate scientist, very assured of the facts that you have found. But I find a very thin line between your scientific passion and your political passion, because it cannot really be a scientific fact that less government is more happiness, or more government is less happiness, or government doesn't matter. Because then you would say that politics could be founded on science too. And that would be quite a far-reaching statement. These are values, after all, that we deal with. So I think you should come clean with your political values. You are a public choice person, which is a political position. It's not a scientific position. Otherwise, all other scientists, all other economists that don't ascribe to public choice would be wrong. And I don't buy that.
Well, let me make it clear. In America, public choice is really right-wing. In Europe, it's not. Public choice is a way of trying to realistically describe political processes and the way they interact with the economy. I am right-wing. Part of my research shows that taxes do not matter. As a right-winger, I would like taxes, I would expect taxes to be bad for happiness. But I'm trying my best to be an honest social scientist, and the conclusion is, hey, taxes do not matter. When I find, and when my colleagues find, that government size matters in a negative way, we also report that. The fun thing is when we report that, oh, you're just a libertarian, you're really right-wing. But we don't hear that. We don't hear that, oh, you're a socialist, when we conclude that taxes do not matter. We're just trying to be honest. We're reporting what we find and what our colleagues find matter and do not matter.
The orange.
Okay, I'm Ingrid Esser, and I'm from the Swedish Institute for Social Research. And I find a gap in research. I'm very involved with attitudes to work and work orientations and job quality. And of course, many people, my colleagues, are involved with studying the level of living and also well-being and mental well-being and so on. But so if I understand you correctly, there is a correlation between mental health and happiness, and health and happiness. Not between health and happiness, but mental health. Physical health?
Mental health, yes. Physical health, probably no.
Less with physical, okay, mental health. And what about having a job or not having a job? Does that affect happiness?
Unemployment.
Sorry, my question is for Christian.
Okay.
Well, I think I'm going to answer in the same way as Philip. Unemployment is really, really bad.
Yes, okay.
Finding a job is really important.
Yeah.
And there is quite detailed research that shows that getting a job is more important when you hit sort of the Protestant Northern Europe. And it's important all over the place, but it's more important in our part of the world.
Yes. Okay, so the gap that I see is that you have so many social policies. Government is all over social policies, and that affects outcomes in terms of mental health, employment, and the quality of employment, etc. It's just an example, and then that supposedly translates into happiness. And I just see a gap, and I'm not following you. So please, if you could clarify why governments should stay out of those fundamental provisions, that would be helpful for your general conclusion that government should stay away from happiness.
You have to separate things. If politicians really listen to us, would they be able to do something positively? Well, perhaps in some areas, yeah. Do they listen to us? No. And what we study is what governments actually do, not what an ideal government would do. And what we see there is that what governments do in this is, for example, employment protection, which keeps young people out of the job market. Spain is a fantastic example right now. The youth unemployment is through the roof. We have, in Denmark, there's no problem because we don't have that employment protection.
Well, I would agree, but I'm obviously not making case for the Spanish government.
No, but I mean, my point is, when we see governments do something actively, that is what they do. Real-life governments implement those kinds of policies, and they're bad. Ideal governments would do something else, but we don't observe ideal governments. I mean, actually, even though we sometimes trust governments, we do that up here, but go to France. French trust in government is lower than in Singapore, which is a dictatorship.
But isn't that what the question is all about? What type of government are we going to have? What type of politics do we want?
Yeah,
that's what kind of societal institutions do we want to have?
Sure, but my take on this is always that government is not automatons. Governments are real people with real passions and real limitations. And what we're then interested in is what do real governments do? We can shout all we want about what we would like governments to do and not to do, but that's not what they're going to do. That's not what we're seeing them do.
But you have a quasi-experimental situation with different countries and different governments, and you see the different outcomes. You see quite disparities in happiness.
Yeah.
Even the poorest people in the richest countries are much happier than the richest people in the poorest countries. Okay, but there are many more questions, so please.
If you just one bit, just to give you an impression of that, rich, poor, how important is it? If you take the 20% poorest Danes and measure their average level of happiness, that is the same as the average for all Swedes. So you shouldn't underestimate the differences between countries that look very similar.
Because the Danish case is special. Actually, we are already running out of time. Or already ran out. Magnus, you have something you want to say?
You haven't thought that discussed the procedural matter, to say that inequality doesn't matter, but to me, it must what you do with it, how this is achieved, in my mind, must be important. So if it's highly unequal, of course, extreme corruption and that it's not, you don't have a good legal system, or I guess that Denmark and Qatar are about the same level of GDP per capita. And in Denmark, it is achieved by people doing something with their lives. In Qatar, they're throwing money on you, and you don't have to do anything. And I wouldn't be surprised if people are more happy in Denmark than in Qatar.
I think actually we're out of time.
Doesn't matter how it's achieved.
I think that the really, really short answer is the more you involve yourself in creating it, yeah, the more it matters. And oil states, well, you just get it for free.
I'm sorry, I know a lot of people want to have more questions, but we're out of time. Attack them with questions. Tolstoy wrote that happy families are all alike, and every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. Maybe that's a pointer towards that we should be more interested in what makes people unhappy than what makes them happy. I don't know. That's a thought.